Well, good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones with SP History. Adjust my camera just slightly here. And today we are continuing with our deep state discussion. And with respect specifically to the CIA and all its covert operations, we got up to or through 1958 yesterday, and today we're going to begin 1959. And this is the beginning of a story that has very long legs and in some ways continues even to this day. But really came of age in the late 50s and caused irreparable harm to the United States in the 60s. And then there was a pause when we got distracted with Vietnam. But, and it's the issue of Cuba. And this is not the first time we've had interest in Cuba. If you remember back when we started this series, our first foreign war was over the issue of Cuba. It was the Spanish-American War. We wanted to capture Cuba the way we had Hawaii, and for the same reasons, for the sugar cane. It was all an effort to help the business community, specifically the fruit companies that wanted access to the climate, the soil, resources of those two places. We succeeded in taking Hawaii. Remember that story, and we succeeded in beating Spain and taking for our possession all those colonies that used to belong to Spain, and created sort of a sovereignty over Cuba. We didn't get Cuba and turn it into a territory or a state, but we certainly had, you know, we had jurisdiction over Cuba, especially because it was in our hemisphere. So we succeeded, at least temporarily, and we've gone through several of the subsequent covert ops. One which was we talked about yesterday, the Phoenix program, which was part and parcel. You know, there were several aspects to the Phoenix program. One was assassination or research, mind control research on the indigenous peoples in Vietnam mainly. But the other part of it was a heroin trafficking ring, the famously referred to as the French Connection, where we would import or export heroin out of the Far East, Vietnam and Laos, into Cuba, who had a puppet regime, Batista, and in exchange for kickbacks, he would process that for us. It was a dropping off point for us before we eventually smuggled it into the United States, into the inner cities. And it had a twofold purpose: one, to raise illicit cash for the CIA and all its covert ops, and second, to poison certain demographic groups in the United States. So we've had a long interest in Cuba, is my point. In 1959, was a revolution had been running for years, and we had on and off supported both sides. But in the end, we wanted our puppet regime to be maintained, and if not, we wanted at least a good enough relationship with the new guy, Fidel Castro, that he would stand in for Batista and continue that relationship. But he didn't do that. When Batista overthrew, or when Castro overthrew Batista, he simultaneously kicked out all the Americans, their business interests, whether legitimate or illegitimate. By that I mean all of the legitimate interests, which would be like the mining interests, the fruit companies, etc. And then the illegitimate were all the mob-owned casinos and brothels and all of the hotels. They basically were in charge of all the tourist industry. He kicked them all out. He famously said, "Cuba is for Cubans." So clearly, we're going to have an issue with this new guy. We sent Nixon to talk to him, and Eisenhower did, ostensibly to kind of fill him in on the facts of life. And Castro just rebuffed him and said, one of the terms that Nixon gave him was, "We'll recognize your government, if you will have no business or dealings with the Soviet Union. And he said, we'll have business dealings with whomever we want. We're a sovereign nation. You don't tell us how to run our country. So almost immediately we knew Castro was going to be a problem. And he had cut off, as far as the CIA was concerned, he was a problem because he severed the French connection. They were no longer able to make money trafficking heroin through Havana. And then, of course, he opened diplomatic relations with the Soviets once we started slapping sanctions on Cuba and embargoes and things of that nature. They turned to the Soviet. We sort of pushed them into the Soviets' arms, what we did. It's very strategically unsound what we did. And then when he nationalized all the oil refineries and the sugar factories and plantations and the mines, and said Cuba is for Cubans, we had a multiplicity of reasons to want to get involved in Cuba. And so we launched an operation called Operation 40 under the supervision of, again, it's the same cast of characters. It always is. CIA Director Alan Dulles, pictured bottom right. Charles Cabal was the Deputy CIA Director, pictured bottom left. And he was sort of put in charge. You know, that's one of the things Dulles would always do is he'd find somebody. We've already seen that in the Operation MK Ultra. He put Sidney Gottlieb in charge, the poisoner in chief. Yesterday we learned about Operation Mockingbird, and he had Frank Wisner whom he put in charge of that. So in this case, his henchman is going to be Charles Cabal. By the way, Charles Cabal is going to have a very famous brother who is simultaneous to the time that Cabal is running Operation 40 for Alan Dulles and the CIA. His brother is acting as mayor of the city of Dallas. Just a little ancillary detail there, but and of course, we find out later his brother was also in the CIA, had been for some time. Asset. Also involved in this project would be Bill Harvey. Bill Harvey is whenever you see Bill Harvey going forward, you see his name, you just know that he's there for one purpose and one purpose only. He is the assassination expert in the CIA. And he will, in Operation 40, be involved in executive action, which is a program to assassinate foreign heads of state, during which time we're going to take over 400 attempts trying to kill Castro. And that's going to be under his direction. And then ZR Rifles, another assassination program. It's different. It's distinguished from executive action, which was foreign. ZR Rifles is a super secret program Bill Harvey was involved in and ran along with another fellow. We'll talk about it later. But and it was on American soil targeting an American target. And it's very interesting. A lot of people don't know about ZR Rifle. I believe it was the successful assassination program that only had one target, and it succeeded. James Angleton would be the CIA counterintelligence chief. He's pictured top left. We've mentioned him before. And then finally, David Atlee Phillips, who's the CIA chief of the Western Hemisphere, based out of Mexico City. So obviously, Cuba's in his hemisphere. These five names you're going to see over and over and over going forward, all the way up into and before, during, and after the JFK assassination. Same cast of characters. The operation recruited for, and this is going to be a method that the CIA uses for these operations, which is instead of getting its own hands dirty, they will recruit people, specifically Cuban-looking people or Cuban nationals who now live in Miami. There's a huge pool of people down in Miami who have motive to want to help the CIA assassinate Castro or get rid of him. They hate him. They fled Cuba for, he forced them to flee Cuba. They'd like to go home. Miami is not their permanent home, or at least they didn't think it was. It's just a temporary respite until they can take care of the problem back home. And so, and of course, the mafioso who used to run Cuba, but got kicked out at the same time, now is stationed up in Florida, operating out of Tampa and Miami, is Santos Trafficante, and these are all his people. They're trained gunmen. They're Cuban exiles. Obviously, you can't recruit white people if you're the CIA to go into Miami or to go into Cuba and run anything covert. They're going to stand out like a sore thumb. So you need Cuban nationals. So this is going to be a continuing theme whereby the CIA hitches its wagons in order to carry out these covert ops in Cuba to organized crime figures here in America. And it's not just Santos's family. There will be ties between the CIA and organized crime up in Chicago with Sam Giancana's family, in New Orleans with Carlos Marcello's family, families in New York. They will use the mob to carry out and do all their dirty work. And they're very motivated and they're expendable. So they, what Santos did, excuse me, they recruited these gunmen from Santos Trafficante, who basically loaned his men to the CIA. And this was a good deal for both. If you're the CIA, you now have a ready and willing army that is expendable. It's off the books. And if you're Santos, you are now in business with the government, which is when this operation succeeds and we get back into Cuba, it's going to look favorably upon you as you reestablish your dominance in Cuba. And in fact, you probably will be doing business with the government, with said government going forward, probably in a reconstitution of the French connection. So he sees potential for business going forward. And this operation, it wasn't necessarily an assassination program at first. It was a harassment program to try to harass the Cuban people into getting rid of Castro themselves. And so these folks were hired by the CIA to go into Cuba, burn their crops, poison their food supplies, act as saboteurs, just generally cause all kinds of mayhem in Cuba, and do it covertly so that the Cuban people think this is just Castro's government being inefficient, or Castro's government causing chaos and sowing all this discord. And why don't you just make it stop? If we get rid of Castro, none of this was happening before Castro. And maybe if we get rid of Castro, it'll stop. The thinking was in 59 that this would succeed in launching a counter-revolution in Cuba against Castro, and that the Cuban people would themselves get rid of the problem. And it failed miserably. One of the reasons it failed was Castro had spies all over Miami. He knew what was coming, when it was coming, who was behind it. And as such, it wasn't very covert. The Cuban people knew who was behind all this mischief. We've talked already, I'm going to take a quick time out here. We've talked already about several reports that have been issued. I think we started with the Doolittle report and we followed up with the Bruce Lovett report yesterday. And both reports were the result of an investigation, an inquiry into the CIA and its activities, and both were very negative. Both said that the CIA was rogue, it was out of control, it was unaccountable, and that it was going to cause further problems down the road if it wasn't reined in. I'm trying to set the stage that there were some people who noticed early on that the CIA was operating outside the bounds and was breaking the law. And they're trying to call attention to it, but unfortunately, no one's listening. In 1960, we have a third report. It's the President's Board of Consultants. Of course, Eisenhower is the president at this time. It's the President's Board of Consultants on Foreign Intelligence Activities Report, 1960. And in this report, quote, the CIA should de-emphasize the cloak and dagger adventures. These are the covert ops under the 5412 committee in favor of intelligence gathering and analysis. In other words, you should get back to the job you were initially assigned to do. And of course, what some folks don't know is that is true. They were assigned to gather intelligence, analyze it, report to the president. That was the declassified part of the bill. But there was a classified part of the bill. Says they were allowed to carry out these covert ops as well. People are finding out after the fact about this classified part of CIA's job description, and they don't like it. And when Eisenhower got this report and he read it, his response was, "I've tried, but I can't change Allen Dulles." It was a direct quote. So Allen Dulles is in conjunction with Richard Nixon. It's interesting. Eisenhower's claiming like he can't control this this rogue CIA operative, but really the guy who's chairing the 5412 committee and authorizing Dulles to do all these rogue operations is his own vice president, Richard Nixon. And Eisenhower says, "Well, I've done what I can," but he kind of washes his hands of the deal, kind of like his farewell address he's going to give before he leaves office, where he warns again of this out of control military industrial congressional complex, which includes the CIA, of course, but was disingenuous in that warning because during the time that he was president, he did nothing to stop it. In fact, he actually contributed to its growth and power. And so anyway, just another example. This is the third warning now. We've had the Doolittle report. We've had the Bruce Lovett report. Now we have this presidential committee that looked into the CIA and said, "Man, again, the gathering of intelligence and analyzing that intelligence, reporting it to the president is a worthwhile endeavor, but this cloak and dagger stuff needs to stop." Interesting too, because Eisenhower is implicated in all these cloak and dagger things because he keeps signing off on it. Every time they need the military to back them up, such as Iran and Guatemala, he signs off on it. So, not that he's been involved in all the cloak and dagger, but he has his fingerprints on some of them that we've already discussed. The rest of the video today, I want to spend time talking about a specific operation or a specific person involved in this Operation 40 and her role in it, because it connects to the JFK assassination later in '63. We don't know it at the time. We find out later, but years later, actually. Her name is Marita Lorenz. Very interesting character. She is actually the former mistress of Fidel Castro. We'll talk about how that came to be. And in '59, when Castro first came to power, I mean, it was like right within days. She is his mistress. And in '60, she ends up in the United States, recruited by the CIA for the purposes of assassinating Castro. So that's the story I want to tell today, how it came to be, and how that connects to where we're going, which is the Kennedy assassination. There was a Liberty Lobby lawsuit that happened years later, whereby an individual named E. Howard Hunt was suing Liberty Lobby, which owned a news outlet that had named him and the CIA as conspirators in the JFK assassination. He'd sued him for libel. And he won. He got a big cash settlement. And at the time of the original case, there was no evidence really that the CIA was involved and that E. Howard Hunt specifically was involved. So he won the libel lawsuit. But on the appeal, which happens almost a decade later, by that point, there was evidence. And there was this witness that Mark Lane, who was acting as one of the attorneys, found. And he put her on the stand, and she told this story. So this story I'm about ready to tell you is not a story that came about because someone wrote a book or someone came forward and testified, or told a fantastic story to the Dallas police or the Warren Commission. This is a story that got dragged out of a witness in court under oath, and then was validated by the jury, which believed her story and found for her to reverse the case, reverse the finding. In other words, instead of finding for E. Howard Hunt, they found against him in the CIA. So it has all the credibility of testimony under oath in a court setting, believed by a jury of her peers. So anyway, she gets brought into this case, and she was sort of the star witness. No one even knew she existed, really. Mark Lane found her. She testified in this case that she, in '63, was an employee of the CIA. Now, you say, well, aren't you skipping ahead? No, believe me, I'm going to tie it all together. Anyway, she said that in '63, she was an employee of the CIA. Remember, this whole case is about whether or not E. Howard Hunt and the CIA killed Kennedy. So obviously, the year in question is going to be '63. But in order for her to tell her story, she's going to go back to '59. And that's where we come in. So anyway, she says that in '63, she was an employee of the CIA, and she'd been recruited by a CIA assassin named Frank Sturgis. And that's another name you need to remember. It's going to come up over and over again as we go forward. Frank Sturgis is his English name. He was a Cuban national. He'd been recruited by the CIA, and he was a full-fledged CIA agent. He is a self-described assassin. Yeah, this isn't something a title I'm given to him. Is when he was asked what his role was later in the CIA, he said, I was an assassin. She witnessed Sturgis receive payments for his CIA work from this same character, E. Howard Hunt, who brought the lawsuit. So she's tying Hunt to Sturgis and the CIA and to herself, saying they're all involved in Operation 40. She said, she, Sturgis, and Hunt were all CIA members of Operation 40, which at the time this case was being brought, nobody even knew about. And here she is telling the story. Here's a collage of pictures of Marita Lorenz. And, once the story broke, all of a sudden everybody wants to know, write about it and tell the story. She wrote a book later, a couple books actually, collaborated with some people. And her story was that she was born in Germany, had an American mom who was an actress, and a German father who was a ship captain. And she was sent to Bergen-Belsen during the war, to the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, because the family had taken an anti-Nazi stand. She was only 5 years old when this happened, so she wasn't Jewish, but she was sent there because they were against Hitler and the Nazi Party. Eventually, the British, as the war wound to a conclusion, the British freed the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, and she had survived, and the Lorenz family was freed. And after the war, the family moved to America in 1950. So she's already had quite an interesting story, beginning at age 5. American mom who was an actress, actually and a German father who's a ship captain. They take a stand against the Nazis. They get punished for it. One of the lucky ones, they survive. They end up in America in 1950. Marita says that she traveled with her dad often on his ships. He was still a ship captain. And in 1959, one of his ships he was captaining a ship that went to Havana, Cuba. This was right after the revolution. And she was 19 years old by this point, and she was on the ship, working the ship with her father. And when they pulled into Havana Harbor, they were met by a sort of a delegation that came from shore on a boat, and they all had beards, is what stood out in her mind. A bearded group of men who demanded that they be allowed to come aboard. And the tallest of the group, whom she noticed right away, she spoke to him and asked who he was, and his response was, quote, "Yo soy Cuba. I am Cuba." And it was Fidel Castro. And he had only been in power for just a few days at the time that they first met. They fell in love almost immediately. She gave him a tour of the boat. He asked for her phone number. This is a picture of her on the left in Cuba as a young girl. This is a picture of her on the right kissing Fidel Castro. This is a picture of her being shown around Havana by Castro in his Jeep. A few days after their first meeting, Castro contacted her. Remember, he has phone number. He has her phone number. And he asks her to come to Cuba. And he says, "I'll send my private plane to pick you up." And she's 19. In the eyes of the law, she's an adult. And so she says yes. He flies her to Cuba. They begin this torrid affair, and she gets pregnant. One day, this is a story she's telling. She's drinking a glass of milk. She's heavily pregnant, and she blacks out. And when she wakes up, she's in the hospital, and she's seriously ill, and she has no baby. And in fact, she continues to get worse. And so they fly her home to New York, where she can get better medical care. And of course, her family still lives there. And during the time that she's in the hospital in New York, she's visited by the CIA, who knows that this woman was having an affair with Castro, is his mistress, is now in the United States. And so they tell her that the reason she's no longer has a baby is that Castro, while she was blacked out, aborted her baby. And Marita says, quote, "I didn't believe it at first, but they did a good job of brainwashing me, telling me that he did this to me. It left me heartbroken." So she believed the agents. Yeah, the baby's not there. What else happened to the baby? So meanwhile, they're telling her that Castro is a threat to her, threat to America, and they're priming that pump, right? They want to recruit Marita. Eventually, they tell her so. They say, we want you to take him out. We want you to go back to Cuba, pretend like everything's fine. You're healed now, and you want to resume your torrid love affair with Fidel Castro. That'll get you close. We've been trying to assassinate him. We can't get close. She said, "They used me because I was the only one that could get back into his bedroom." And so she's mad. You know, they've told her this lie about her baby to provoke her and to sort of manipulate her is what they're trying to do. She's furious with Castro. And so she joins the anti-Castro movement, agrees to do this operation. And Sturgis, I've got Sturgis here pictured several times. You can see top left, he's in the red circle. That's Frank Sturgis. His Cuban name was Fiorini, Frank Fiorini. And there he is, top right, on the right of those three people, and then down below, a signed photograph there, pictured in the red circle. Always with these anti-Castro revolutionaries, these mercenaries. He's one himself, but he's CIA. Don't ever forget that. He's an assassin, is what he is. So he's an assassin himself, trying to assassinate Castro as part of Operation 40. And now he has his number one draft choice who can get into Castro's bedroom and take him out for him. So they fly her, the CIA flies her to Cuba in 1960, and they give her these poison pills. And what the operation is, when she has opportunity, she's to sneak these poison pills into I don't know, Castro's toothpaste or drink or whatever. And of course, because he's trusting of her, ostensibly, or he won't suspect anything. So that's the scheme. She gets back to Cuba and sort of reunites with Castro, and she falls under. She says so herself. I just fell under a spell. Um, she says, "I loved Castro too much to kill him." In fact, in one of their, she says, as an older woman, it's almost odd to hear someone like her age talk like this, but she talks about how Castro was such a legendary love maker, and it just she just fell under his spell. And she said that one time after one of these legendary lovemaking sessions, she actually spilled the beans and told Castro why she came back, what she was supposed to do to him. She told him. And, it's interesting. He didn't kill her. He didn't put her in prison or anything. It's one of the things about Castro. I think he did this many times with people who were sent by the CIA to do harm to him or spy on him. And he figured out, and he turned them. And then they ended up doing work for him. So they sends them back. They sort of become double agents. Anyway, she returns to the U.S. and has to tell the CIA what happened. She makes up this excuse. She says that the poison pills, she hid them in a container of cold cream. And when she went to look for them, the cold cream had dissolved the pills. Was what she told. But they were furious with her. Frank Sturgis was furious with her. You failed. This was our best chance. You failed. And they reminded her of this over and over. And as Castro becomes a bigger thorn in the side of the Americans going forward, they keep reminding her, this could have all been done and over with if you'd have carried out your part of this process, part of the plot. And nevertheless, she comes back and she next works as a gun runner in Operation 40 for the upcoming Bay of Pigs operation, which is going to take place in 61. And this is obviously an operation that wouldn't be necessary if she had killed him, but now it is necessary. And she was assigned by the CIA after the Bay of Pigs failed to collect donations for the anti-communist cause from a former Venezuelan dictator, Marcos Perez Jimenez, who's now living in Florida, has a bunch of money. And so basically the CIA is using her. They said, get close to this former. They already used her to get close to Castro. Now because she was close to Castro, and now they're using her because she was beautiful. And they said, go get close to this guy. He's living here in town, Miami, and get his money. And again, the CIA has pretty much Operation 50 or the 5412 Committee, pretty much an unlimited budget to carry out all these covert ops. Evidently, they needed money, and in spite of that, the French connection used to be a nice source of that illicit cash from which they could draw to carry out these covert operations. That's been shut down. So they're looking for alternate sources of income. So they tell her, this Marcos Perez Jimenez has all this money. We want you to get it out of him. And, we don't care what you do, how it happens. You just work your magic like you did on Castro. So she becomes his mistress for the next 2 years, had a daughter with him as well. So she got pregnant with Castro, and allegedly that baby has been aborted. And then she has a baby daughter with Jimenez. And in 63, continuing her story, she said that she met somebody. She met one of the Operation 40 members at a camp where they were training, and he claimed to be Lee Harvey Oswald. And according to her, he was there recruiting about 30 anti-Castro Cubans and their American contacts or handlers to an assassin squad. And this was allegedly to kill Castro. She claimed that the group was going to kill Castro and President Kennedy because these anti-Castroites were as furious with Kennedy now as they were with Castro. Castro was their number one enemy. And if Kennedy hadn't, quote, lost his nerve and canceled the air support and Bay of Pigs, their number one enemy would be dead and gone. But now Kennedy's becoming a problem because he doesn't have the stomach for the fight. So they hate Kennedy too, especially because a lot of their brothers, a lot of their fellow countrymen died at the Bay of Pigs, and they blame Kennedy for that. So, according to Marita Lorenz, this meeting that she had with this so-called Oswald was at an Operation 40 training base in the Florida Everglades, which we found out later, by CIA documents, that indeed the Operation 40 bases that were scattered about, one of them was in the Everglades, and it was overseen by E. Howard Hunt. Remember, she's in this trial giving this testimony about E. Howard Hunt, his connections to the CIA and Operation 40 and how she knows him. She says, well, I saw him getting paid by the CIA. He was over me. He worked with Frank Sturgis. And I saw him at the Everglades base with somebody else claiming to be Lee Harvey Oswald. Here's a couple pictures. Sturgis allegedly is the man in the right with the hat. Oswald is the man on the left. If you know anything about Oswald, you know he's not that tall. So pretty clearly this is an imposter, which is not unusual. We're going to get into a lot of imposters going forward, but he's using Oswald's name. Here's a group photo. Marita is the one pictured in the far right circle. E. Howard Hunt is the middle circle. If you see my cursor there, this is Frank Sturgis, and of course, the man claimed to be Oswald's on the far left. According to Marita, Oswald, along with Sturgis and several other anti-Castro Cubans stationed in Miami whom she knew, she named them. Orlando Bosch was one, and it's pictured top right. Pedro Diaz-Lanz, pictured bottom left. Marita's on the bottom right, and Frank Sturgis is top left. Had a meeting one time in Miami, and this was right before the assassination happened in November '63. Anyway, they met in Miami, and they were planning a secret road trip from Miami to Dallas. It should be a pretty lengthy road trip. And she said that at this meeting, they spread Dallas street maps on a table and they were studying them. Now, she was a gun runner at this time, so she was operating under the assumption, because they filled the trunk. According to her, she says, we left for Dallas in 2 cars soon after the meeting. They took turn driving, and a 1,300-mile trip took about 2 days. And in the trunk was a bunch of weapons. So in her mind, this was just another gun running operation. Now, she's going to put 2 and 2 together here pretty quick, but it's interesting why they would need to spread Dallas street maps out on a table if you're just running guns to a certain location. They're studying the city of Dallas for a reason. They're running the guns, she thinks, for this anti-Castro Operation 40, although she notes it was unusual for the guns to be going from Miami to Dallas. Usually they're going from Dallas to Miami. Miami was the last stop before Cuba. And she was intrigued why they would be running weapons to Dallas and looking at street maps, Dallas. Anyway, she said that she, Sturgis, and the others traveled from Miami to Dallas in November of '63 to deliver weapons for what she was told was just an operation. She didn't know what it was, and she didn't ask, at least not initially. And when they got there, they met in a Dallas hotel room, and she and Sturgis went into the hotel room and met E. Howard Hunt, was waiting for him. And this is where she witnessed Hunt pay Sturgis for the weapons. Or sitting outside in the car, the trunk. An hour later, As they're sitting in the hotel room, there's a knock on the door, and a man whom she later identified as Jack Ruby was standing at the door. And in fact, she remembers that meeting because Jack Ruby took notice of her and got mad at E. Howard Hunt, said, "Who is she? Why is she here?" And was reassured that she's part of their operation, that she can be trusted, etc. Ruby was real suspicious of her and treated her pretty poorly. And she remembered that. That stuck out in her mind. According to her memory, as she's testifying, telling this story, she said all this happened on November 21st. So they got to Dallas on November 21st. They unloaded the guns. They went to the hotel room and unloaded the guns. E. Howard Hunt paid Sturgis. Ruby comes to the door. This all happens on November 21st. Of course, we all know what happens the next day, the 22nd. On early the next morning, she left Dallas. She didn't stay. Now, she was supposed to stay, but she said, quote, "I knew this was different from other jobs. This was not just gun running. This was big, very big, and I wanted to get out. I told Sturgis I wanted to leave. He said it was a very big operation, but that my part was not dangerous. I was to be a decoy." You remember the story of John Mulholland, the magician who taught the CIA how to use diversion and decoys. Before he could go further, I said, "Please let me get out. I want to go back to my baby, Jimenez, little girl, or little girl she had with Jimenez." Finally, he agreed, and he drove me to the airport. Then the assassination happens. And she goes to the FBI and she reports everything that she's telling in this story. But she says, quote, "The FBI didn't want to know because those were CIA activities, not FBI." Which is interesting because here she is telling the story and it's tying all of this CIA activity directly to the assassination. And the jury's listening to this. And they're being asked to settle this dispute whether or not E. Howard Hunt and the CIA had anything to do with the assassination. If it didn't, then this news organization that said it did had committed libel. But if it did, then all they're doing is printing the truth. Anyway, she's still on the stand, and she said Sturgis later called her. They talked on the phone. She said that he told her, "We killed the president that day. You could have been a part of it, part of history. You could have stayed. It was safe. Everything was covered in advance. No arrests, no real newspaper investigation. It was all covered, very professional." And, this is not unusual for a witness during this period to go to the FBI to report something and the FBI to completely just ignore it. If you happen to check out my whole JFK series, it happens over and over and over again, which implicates the FBI as well, not just the CIA. Anyway, as a result of her testimony on February 7th, 19, you can see how long it took for us to learn this. This is 85. The assassination happened in 63. So, 22 years. We, the jury, find for the defendant, Liberty Lobby, and against the plaintiff, E. Howard Hunt. Leslie Armstrong, the jury foreperson, told the media, quote, "The evidence clearly demonstrated that Hunt and the CIA assassinated President Kennedy." And they're using the story of Marita Lorenz as their evidence. And then, of course, it does a picture of E. Howard Hunt years later on his deathbed. And on his deathbed, he did make a confession. All these years, he denied. But we got to 2007, and he finally confessed. He wrote it out, a flow chart, who ordered it, who was there, his role, etc., everything. So the jury got it right. Marita Lorenz's story was validated. And there's all kinds of corroboration of her story from other witnesses. But that's not the point of this video. This video is to just introduce you to the story of Marita Lorenz and this Operation 40 and how it was one of these covert operations designed to, at first, sabotage cause mayhem in Cuba so that the Cuban people would rise up, revolt against Castro. But eventually, it became an assassination operation. And Marita Lorenz was intricately involved in two of the attempts. One herself, when she was sent with poison pills, and the other when she made a trip to Dallas with the folks who eventually did kill him. And these are all CIA assets or agents. Not a single one of these people that we've named today were not CIA. Frank Sturgis was a CIA assassin, self-described. E. Howard Hunt was a CIA officer. We've already heard his role in Operation Mockingbird was to create a pool of book reviewers and movie reviewers who would write bad reviews of anything published in America that was anti-CIA and favorable reviews of all of their captured media assets and the books that they wrote, the movies that they did. So we've already seen him before. Now he's involved in this Operation 40. He runs that base down the Everglades where someone's pretending to be Lee Harvey Oswald. And he's in Dallas, not just the day before the assassination, but the day of the assassination, according to Marita Lorenz. And he would deny later, over and over and over again, that he was in Dallas. But we have multiple witnesses. And eventually the CIA, when Watergate happens, has to, they circulate an internal memo that says we're going to have to cut E. Howard Hunt loose because at some point someone's going to learn the truth that he was in Dallas on the day JFK was killed. So even the CIA acknowledged it in their own documents. So all of these players are CIA, and they're all involved in this covert operation against Castro, which gets turned against Kennedy. Now, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but I just wanted to kind of show you what Operation 40 was about, because we're going to reference it over and over and over again going forward, and what it turned into, and who some of the players were, and introduce you to the story of Marita Lorenz. So that's it for today. Thank you for joining. Hit the subscribe button, the like button. Feel free to comment. Feel free to share. And until next time, God bless. Thank you.